Reaching a hillock of porphyry, they scanned the horizon in every direction. They had now gained the summit of the Andes, which commanded an extended prospect. To the east, the sides of the mountains declined by gentle gradations, down which they could see the peons sliding several hundred feet below. In the distance extended long lines of scattered rocks and stones that had been crowded back by glacial avalanches. The valley of the Colorado was already growing dim in the increasing twilight. The elevations of land, the crags and the peaks, illumined by the rays of the sun, gradually faded, and darkness covered the whole eastern slope of the Andes. Towards the north undulated a succession of ridges that mingled together insensibly. To the south, however, the view was magnificent, and as night descended, the grandeur was inimitable. Looking down into the wild valley of Torbido, you saw Mount Antuco, whose yawning crater was 2 miles distant. The volcano, like some enormous monster, belched forth glowing smoke mingled with torrents of bright flame. The circle of the mountains that enclosed it seemed to be on fire. Showers of incandescent stones, clouds of reddish vapors, and streams of lava, united in glittering columns. A loud rumbling that increased every moment, and was followed by a dazzling flash, filled this vast circuit with its sharp reverberations, while the sun, his light gradually fading, disappeared as a star is extinguished in the shadows of the horizon. Food brought to the door. Paganel and Glenarvan would have remained a long time to contemplate this magnificent struggle of the fires of earth with those of heaven, and the improvised woodcutters were becoming admirers of nature. But Wilson, less enthusiastic, reminded them of their situation. Wood was wanting, it is true, but fortunately a scanty and dry moss clothed the rocks. An ample supply was taken, as well as of a plant whose roots were quite combustible. This precious fuel was brought to the hut and piled in the fireplace, but it was difficult to kindle the fire and especially to keep it burning. When the viands were prepared, each one drank several mouthfuls of hot coffee with delight. As for the dried meat, it appeared a little unsatisfactory, which provoked on the part of Paganel a remark as useless as it was true. "Indeed," said he, "I must confess a llama steak would not be bad just now." "What?" cried the Major. "Are you not content with our supper, Paganel?" "Enchanted, my good Major, but I acknowledge a plate of venison would be welcome." "You are a sybarite," said MacNab. "I accept the title, Major, but you yourself, whatever you may say, would not be displeased with a beefsteak." "Probably not." "And if you were asked to take your post at the cannon, you would go without a word." "Certainly, and although it pleases you." His companions had not heard any more, when distant and prolonged howls were heard. They were not the cries of scattered animals, but those of a herd approaching with rapidity. Would Providence, after furnishing them with shelter, give them their supper? Such was the thought of the geographer. But Glenarvan humbled his joy somewhat by observing that the animals of the Andes were never met with in so elevated a region. "Whence comes the noise, then?" asked Tom Austin. "Hear how it approaches." "An avalanche," said Mulrady. "Impossible, these are real howls," replied Paganel. "Let us see," cried Glenarvan. "Let us see like hunters," answered the Major as he took his rifle. All rushed out of the hut. Night had come. It was dark, but the sky was studded with stars. The moon had not yet shown her disk. The peaks on the north and east were lost in the darkness, and the eye only perceived the grotesque outlines of a few towering rocks. The howls, those of terrified animals, were redoubled. They came from the dark side of the mountain. What was going on? Suddenly there came a furious avalanche, but one of living creatures, mad with terror. The whole plateau seemed to tremble. There were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of these animals. Were they wild beasts of the pampas, or only llamas? The whole party had only time to throw themselves to the earth, while this living whirlwind passed a few feet above them. At this moment, the report of a firearm was heard. The Major had shot at a venture. He thought that a large animal fell a few paces from him, while the whole herd, carried along by their resistless motion, disappeared down the slopes illumined by the volcano. "Ah, I have them," cried a voice, that of Paganel. "What have you?" asked Glenarvan. "My glasses, to be sure." "You are not wounded?" "No, a little kick, but by what?" "By this," replied the Major, dragging after him the animal he had shot. Each one hastened to gain the hut, and by the light of the fire MacNab's prize was examined. It was a pretty animal, resembling a little camel without a hump. It had a small head, flat body, long legs and claws, fine coffee-colored hair, and its breast was spotted with white. Scarcely had Paganel looked at it when he exclaimed, "It is a guanaco." "What is that?" asked Glenarvan. "An animal that eats itself." "And is it good?" "A dish for the gods." "Delicious, a dish for the gods. I knew well that you would like fresh meat for supper, and what meat this is, but who will dress the animal?" "I will," said Wilson. "Well, I will engage to broil it," replied Paganel. "You are a cook then, Monsieur Paganel," said Robert. "Certainly, my boy, a Frenchman is always a cook." In a little while Paganel placed large slices of meat on the coals, and in a short time, served up to his companions this appetizing viand. No one hesitated, but each attacked it ravenously. To the great amazement of the geographer, a general grimace accompanied by a "Pee-wah" followed the first mouthful. "It is horrible," said one. "It is not eatable," replied another. The poor geographer, whatever was the difficulty, was forced to agree that this steak was not acceptable even to starving men. They therefore began to launch jokes at him and deride his dish for the gods, while he himself sought a reason for this unaccountable result. "I have it," he cried, "I have it." "Is the meat too old?" asked MacNab calmly. "No, my intolerant major, but it has traveled too much. How could I forget that?" "What do you mean?" asked Tom Austin. "I mean that the animal is not good unless killed when at rest. I can affirm from the taste that it has come from a distance, and consequently, the whole herd." "You are certain of this," said Glenarvan. "Absolutely so." But what event could have terrified these animals so, and driven them at a time when they ought to be peacefully sleeping in their lairs? "As to that, my dear Glenarvan," said Paganel, "it is impossible for me to say. If you believe me, let us search no farther. For my part, I am dying for want of sleep. Let us retire, Major." "Very well, Paganel." Thereupon each wrapped himself in his poncho. The fuel was replenished for the night, and soon all but Glenarvan were buried in profound repose. He alone did not sleep. A secret uneasiness held him in a state of wakeful fatigue. He could not help thinking of that herd, flying in one common direction of their inexplicable terror. They could not have been pursued by wild beasts. At that height there were scarcely any, and yet fewer hunters. What fright had driven them over the abysses of Antuco, and what was the cause of it? He thought of their strange situation, and felt a presentiment of coming danger. However, under the influence of a partial drowsiness, his ideas gradually modified, and fear gave place to hope. He saw himself in anticipation, on the morrow, on the plain at the foot of the Andes. There his actual search was to begin, and success was not, perhaps, far distant. He thought of Captain Grant and his 2 sailors, delivered from a cruel slavery. These images passed rapidly before his mind, every instant interrupted by a flash of fire, a spark, a flame, illumining the faces of his sleeping companions, and casting a flickering shadow over the walls of the hut. Then his presentiments returned with more vividness, while he listened vaguely to the external sounds so difficult to explain on these solitary summits. At one moment he thought he heard distant rumblings, dull and threatening like the rollings of thunder. These sounds could be caused only by a tempest raging on the sides of the mountain. He wished to convince himself and left the hut. The moon had risen, and the sky was clear and calm. Not a cloud was to be seen either above or below, only now and then the moving shadows of the flames of the volcano. At the zenith twinkled thousands of stars, while the rumbling still continued. They seemed to approach and run along the chain of the mountains. The internal rumblings, the din of the avalanche, the crash of the blocks of granite, and the whirlwinds of snow rendered all communication with each other impossible. Glenarvan returned more uneasy than before, seeking to divine what relation there was between these subterranean noises and the flight of the guanacos. He looked at his watch. It was 2 o'clock. However, having no certain knowledge of immediate danger, he did not wake his companions, whom fatigue held in a deep repose, but fell himself into a heavy sleep that lasted several hours. All at once a violent crash startled him to his feet. It was a deafening roar, like the irregular noise of innumerable artillery wagons rolling over a hollow pavement. Glenarvan suddenly felt the earth tremble beneath his feet. He saw the hut sway and start open. "Look out!" he cried. His companions, awakened and thrown into confusion, were hurried down a rapid descent. The day was breaking, and the scene was terrible. The form of the mountains suddenly changed, their tops were truncated, the tottering peaks disappeared as if a pitfall had opened at their base. A mass, several miles in extent, became detached entire and slid towards the plain. "An earthquake!" cried Paganel. He was not mistaken. It was one of those phenomena frequent on the mountain frontier of Chile. This portion of the globe is disturbed by subterranean fires, and the volcanoes of this chain afford only insufficient outlets for the confined vapors. In the meantime, the plateau, to which 7 stunned and terrified men clung by the tufts of moss, glided with the rapidity of an express. Not a cry was possible, not a movement of escape. They could not hear each other. The internal rumblings, the din of the avalanche, the crash of the blocks of granite, and the whirlwinds of snow rendered all communication with each other impossible. A steep gradient. At one time, the mass would slide without jolts or jars. At another, seized with a pitching and rolling motion like the deck of a vessel shaken by the billows, it would run along the edge of the abysses into which the fragments of the mountain fell, uproot the trees of centuries, and level with the precision of an enormous scythe all the inequalities of the eastern slope. How long this indescribable scene lasted, no one could tell. In what abyss all were to be engulfed, no one was able to foresee. Whether they were all there alive, or whether one of them was lying at the bottom of a crevasse, no one could say. Stunned by the swiftness of the descent, chilled by the keenness of the cold, blinded by the whirlwinds of snow, they panted, exhausted and almost inanimate, and only clung to the rocks by the supreme instinct of preservation. All at once, a shock of unusual violence arrested their gliding vehicle. They were thrown forward and rolled upon the last declivities of the mountains. The plateau had stopped short. For a few moments no one stirred. At last one rose, deafened by the shock but yet firm. It was the Major. He shook off the snow that blinded him and looked around. His companions were not very far from one another. He counted them. All but one lay on the ground. The missing one was Robert Grant. Chapter 14. Providentially rescued. The eastern side of the Andes consists of long slopes, declining gradually to the plain upon which a portion of the mass had suddenly stopped. In this new country, garnished with rich pastures and adorned with magnificent vegetation, an incalculable number of apple trees, planted at the time of the conquest, glowed with their golden fruit and formed true forests. It seemed as if a part of beautiful Normandy had been cast into these monotonous regions, and under any other circumstances, the eye of a traveler would have been struck with this sudden transition from desert to oasis, from snowy peak to verdant prairie, from winter to summer. The earth had regained an absolute immobility, and the earthquake had ceased. But without doubt, the subterranean forces were still exerting their devastating action at a distance, for the chain of the Andes is always agitated or trembling in some part. This time, however, the commotion had been of extreme violence. The outline of the mountains was entirely changed. A new view of summits, crests, and peaks was defined against the azure of the sky, and the guide of the Pampas would have sought in vain for his accustomed landmarks. Comedy changed to tragedy. A wonderfully beautiful day was breaking. The rays of the sun, issuing from their watery bed in the Atlantic, glittered over the Argentine plains and were already silvering the waves of the other ocean. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. Glenarvan and his companions, revived by the aid of the Major, gradually recovered consciousness. Indeed, they had only undergone a severe giddiness. The mountain was descended, and they would have applauded a means of locomotion which had been entirely at nature's expense, if one of the feeblest, Robert Grant, had not been missing. Everyone loved the courageous boy. Paganel was particularly attached to him, the Major too, in spite of his coldness, but especially Glenarvan. When the latter learned of Robert's disappearance, he was desperate. He pictured to himself the poor child engulfed in some abyss, and calling vainly for him whom he considered his second father. "My friends," said he, scarcely restraining his tears, "we must search for him, we must find him, we cannot abandon him thus. Every valley, every precipice, every abyss must be explored to the very bottom. You shall tie a rope around me and let me down. I will do it, you hear me, I will. May heaven grant that Robert is still living. Without him, how could we dare find his father? What right have we to save Captain Grant if his rescue costs the life of his child? His companions listened without speaking. They felt that he was seeking in their looks some ray of hope, and they lowered their eyes. Well, continued Glenarvan, you understand me, you are silent, you have no more hope. A few moments of silence ensued, when MacNab inquired, "Who of you, my friends, remembers when Robert disappeared?" To this question, no answer was given. "At least," continued the Major, "you can tell with whom the boy was during the descent." "With me," replied Wilson. "Well, at what moment did you last see him with you? Recall the circumstances. Speak." "This is all that I remember. Robert Grant was at my side, his hand grasping a tuft of moss, less than 2 minutes before the shock that caused our descent." Less than 2 minutes. Remember, Wilson, the minutes may have seemed long to you. Are you not mistaken? I think not. Yes, it is so. Less than 2 minutes. Well, said MacNab, and was Robert on your right or on your left? On my left. I remember that his poncho flapped in my face. And where were you situated in reference to us? On the left also. Then Robert could have disappeared only on this side, said the Major, turning towards the mountain and pointing to the right. And also considering the time that has elapsed since his disappearance, the child must have fallen at a high part of the mountain. There we must search, and by taking different ways, we shall find him. Not a word more was said. The 6 men, scaling the declivities of the mountain, stationed themselves at different heights along the ridge and began their search. They kept always to the right of their line of descent, sounding the smallest fissures, descending to the bottom of precipices half filled with fragments of the mass, and more than one came forth with his garments in shreds, his feet and hands lacerated at the peril of his life. A sleepless night. All this portion of the Andes, except a few inaccessible plateaus, was carefully explored for many hours without one of these brave men thinking of rest. But it was a vain search. The child had not only found death in the mountains, but also a tomb, the stone of which, made of some enormous rock, was forever closed over him. Towards noon Glenarvan and his companions, bruised and exhausted, found themselves again in the valley. The former was a prey to the most violent grief. He scarcely spoke, and from his lips issued only these words, broken by sighs, "I will not go, I will not go." Each understood this determination, and respected it. "We will wait," said Paganel to the Major and Tom Austin. "Let us take some rest and recruit our strength. We shall need it, whether to begin our search or continue our journey." "Yes," replied MacNab, "let us remain since Edward wishes it. He hopes, but what does he hope?" "God knows," said Tom Austin. "Poor Robert," replied Paganel, wiping his eyes. Trees thronged the valley in great numbers. The Major chose a group of lofty carob trees, under which was established a temporary encampment. A few blankets, the arms, a little dried meat, and some rice was all that remained to the travelers. A stream which flowed not far off furnished water, still muddy from the effects of the avalanche. Mulrady kindled a fire on the grass, and soon presented to his master a warm and comforting repast. But Glenarvan refused it, and remained stretched on his poncho in profound prostration. Thus the day passed. Night came, clear and calm as the preceding. While his companions lay motionless, although wakeful, Glenarvan reascended the mountain. He listened closely, still hoping that a last cry might reach him. He ventured alone and afar, pressing his ear to the ground, listening, restraining the beatings of his heart, and calling in a voice of despair. The whole night long he wandered on the mountain. Sometimes Paganel, sometimes the Major, followed him, ready to help him on the slippery summits or on the edge of the chasms where his rashness led him. But his last efforts were fruitless, and to the cry of "Robert, Robert," 1,000 times repeated, echo alone replied. Day dawned, and it was necessary to go in search of Glenarvan on the mountain, and bring him in spite of his reluctance back to the encampment. His despair was terrible. Who would now dare to speak to him of departure, and propose leaving this fatal valley? But the provisions were failing. They would soon meet the Argentine guides and horses to take them across the Pampas. To retrace their steps was more difficult than to advance. Besides, the Atlantic was the place appointed to meet the Duncan. All these reasons did not permit a longer delay, and it was for the interest of all that the hour for departure should be no longer deferred. MacNab attempted to draw Glenarvan from his grief, For a long time he spoke without his friend appearing to hear him. Glenarvan shook his head. At length, words escaped his lips. "Go," said he. "Yes, go. 1 hour more." "Well, 1 hour more," replied the worthy major. When it had passed, Glenarvan asked for another. You would have thought a condemned man was praying for his life. Thus it continued till about noon, when Mac Nab, by the advice of all, would no longer hesitate, and told Glenarvan that they must go. The lives of his companions depended upon a prompt decision. "Yes, yes," replied Glenarvan, we will go." But as he spoke his eyes were turned away from Mac Nab. His gaze was fixed upon a black speck in the air. Suddenly his hand rose, and remained immovable, as if petrified. "There, there," cried he, see. The bird had raised him by his garments, and was now hovering in midair at least 150 feet above the encampment. He had perceived the travelers, and was violently striving to escape with his heavy prey. All eyes were raised towards the sky, in the direction so imperatively indicated. At that moment the black speck visibly increased. It was a bird hovering at a measureless height. "A condor," said Paganel. "Yes, a condor," replied Glenarvan. "Who knows, he is coming, he is descending, let us wait." What did Glenarvan hope? Was his reason wandering? He had said, "Who knows?" Paganel was not mistaken. The condor became more distinct every moment. This magnificent bird, long revered by the Incas, is the king of the southern Andes. In these regions he attains an extraordinary development. His strength is prodigious, and he often precipitates oxen to the bottom of the abysses. He attacks sheep, goats, and calves wandering on the plain, and carries them in his talons to a great height. Sometimes he hovers at an elevation beyond the limit of human vision, and there this king of the air surveys, with a piercing look, the regions below, and distinguishes the faintest objects with a power of sight that is the astonishment of naturalists. What had the condor seen? A corpse, that of Robert Grant. "Who knows?" repeated Glenarvan without losing sight of him. The enormous bird approached, now hovering, now falling with the swiftness of inert bodies. He soon described circles of larger extent, and could be perfectly distinguished. He measured 15 feet across his wings, which supported him in the air almost without motion, for it is the peculiarity of these great birds to sail with a majestic calmness, unlike all others of the winged tribes. The Major and Wilson had seized their rifles, but Glenarvan stopped them with a gesture. The condor was approaching in the circles of his flight, a sort of inaccessible plateau, a quarter of a mile distant. He was turning with a vertical rapidity, opening and closing his formidable claws, and shaking his cartilaginous neck. "Something worse." "There's there," cried Glenarvan. Then suddenly, a thought flashed through his mind. "If Robert is still living," exclaimed he with a cry of terror, "this bird, fire, my friends, fire." But he was too late. The condor had disappeared behind the lofty boulders. A second passed that seemed an eternity, then the enormous bird reappeared, heavily laden and rising slowly. A cry of horror was uttered. In the claws of the condor, an inanimate body was seen suspended and dangling. It was Robert Grant. The bird had raised him by his garments, and was now hovering in midair at least 150 feet above the encampment. He had perceived the travelers, and was violently striving to escape with his heavy prey. "May Robert's body be dashed upon these rocks," cried Glenarvan, "rather than serve." He did not finish, but seizing Wilson's rifle, attempted to take aim at the condor. But his arm trembled, he could not sight the piece. His eyes were dimmed. "Let me try," said the Major. With clear eye, steady hand, and motionless body, he aimed at the bird that was already 300 feet above him. But he had not pressed the trigger when a report resounded in the valley. A light smoke curled up between two rocks, and the condor, shot in the head, fell, slowly turning, sustained by his broad outspread wings. He had not released his prey, and at last reached the ground, 10 paces from the banks of the stream. "Quick, quick," said Glenarvan, and without seeking whence this providential shot had come, he rushed towards the condor. His companions closely followed him. "The lost is found." When they arrived, the bird was dead, and the body of Robert was hidden under its great wings. Glenarvan threw himself upon the child, released him from the talons of the condor, stretched him on the grass, and pressed his ear to his breast. Never did a wilder cry of joy issue from human lips than when Glenarvan rose, exclaiming, "He lives, he lives!" In an instant Robert was stripped of his garments, and his face bathed with fresh water. He made a movement, opened his eyes, looked around, and uttered a few words. "You, my lord, my father." Glenarvan could not speak. Emotion stifled him, and kneeling, he wept beside this child so miraculously saved. Chapter 15. Sal Cave. After the great danger that he had just escaped, Robert incurred another, no less great, that of being overwhelmed with caresses. However feeble he was still, not one of these good people could refrain from pressing him to his heart. But it must be confessed that these well-meant embraces are not fatal, for the boy did not die. When his rescue was certain, thought reverted to his rescuer, and the Major very naturally thought of looking around him. 50 paces from the stream, a man of lofty stature was standing, motionless, on one of the first ledges of the mountain. A long gun lay at his feet. This individual, who had so suddenly appeared, had broad shoulders and long hair tied with leathern thongs. His height exceeded 6 feet, and his bronzed face was red between his eyes and mouth, black below his eyelids, and white on his forehead. After the manner of the Patagonians of the frontiers, the native wore a splendid cloak, decorated with red arabesques, made of the skin of a guanaco, its silky fur turned outward, and sewed with ostrich tendons. Under his cloak, a tippet of foxskin encircled his neck and terminated in a point in front. At his girdle hung a little bag containing the colors with which he painted his face. His leggings were of ox hide, and fastened to the ankle with straps regularly crossed. The figure of this Patagonian was fine, and his face denoted real intelligence in spite of the colors that adorned it. He waited in an attitude full of dignity, and seeing him so motionless and stern on his pedestal of rocks, you would have taken him for a statue. The Major, as soon as he perceived him, pointed him out to Glenarvan, who hastened towards him. The Patagonian took 2 steps forward. Glenarvan took his hand and pressed it. There was in the latter's look, in his physiognomy, such a feeling, such an expression of gratitude, that the native could not mistake it. He inclined his head gently, and uttered a few words that neither the Major nor his friend could understand. The Patagonian, after regarding the strangers attentively, now changed the language. But whatever it was, this new idiom was no better understood than the first. However, certain expressions which he used struck Glenarvan. They seemed to belong to the Spanish language, of which he knew several common words. "Spanish," said he. The Patagonian nodded. "Well," said the Major, "this is our friend Paganel's business. It is fortunate that he thought of learning Spanish." Paganel was called. He came at once, and with all the grace of a Frenchman saluted the Patagonian, to which the latter paid no attention. The geographer was informed of the state of affairs, and was only too glad to use his diligently acquired knowledge. "Something wrong." "Exactly," said he, and opening his mouth widely in order to articulate better, he said, in his best Spanish, "You are a brave man." The native listened, but did not answer. "He does not understand," said the geographer. "Perhaps you do not pronounce well," replied the Major. "Very true, curse the pronunciation." And again Paganel began, but with no better success. "I will change the expression," said he, and pronouncing with magisterial slowness, he uttered these words. "A Patagonian, doubtless." The native remained mute as before. "Answer," added Paganel. The Patagonian did not reply. "Do you understand?" cried Paganel, violently enough to damage his organs of speech. It was evident that the Indian did not understand, for he answered, but in Spanish. "I do not understand." It was Paganel's turn now to be astonished, and he hastily put on his glasses, like one irritated. "May I be hanged," said he, "if I understand a word of this infernal jargon. It is certainly Araucanian." "No," replied Glenarvan, "this man answered in Spanish." And turning to the Patagonian, he repeated, "Spanish." "Yes," replied the native. Paganel's surprise became amazement. The Major and Glenarvan looked at him quizzingly. "Ah, my learned friend," said the Major, while a half-smile played about his lips, "you have committed one of those blunders peculiar to you." "What?" cried the geographer, starting. Yes, it is plain that this Patagonian speaks Spanish. He. A man of lofty stature was standing, motionless, on one of the first ledges of the mountain. This individual had broad shoulders and long hair tied with leathern thongs. A peninsular Babel. Yes, by mistake you have learnt another language, while thinking that you studied. MacNab did not finish. A loud "oh" from the geographer, accompanied by shrugs of the shoulders, cut him short. Major, you are going a little too far, said Paganel in a very dry tone. To be sure, since you do not understand. I do not understand because this native speaks so badly, answered the geographer, who began to be impatient. That is to say, he speaks badly because you do not understand, returned the major calmly. MacNab, said Glenarvan, that is not a probable supposition. However abstracted our friend Paganel may be, we cannot suppose that his blunder was to learn one language for another. Now, my dear Edward, or rather you, my good Paganel, explain to me what the difficulty is. I will not explain, replied Paganel, I insist. Here is the book in which I practice daily the difficulties of the Spanish language. Examine it, Major, and you will see whether I impose upon you. So saying, Paganel groped in his numerous pockets. After searching a few moments, he drew forth a volume in a very bad state, and presented it with an air of assurance. The Major took the book and looked at it. Well, what work is this? He asked. The Lusiad, replied Paganel, an admirable poem which... The Lusiad, cried Glenarvan. Yes, my friend, the Lusiad of the immortal Camões, nothing more or less. Camões, repeated Glenarvan. But unfortunate friend, Camões was a Portuguese. It is Portuguese that you have been studying for 6 weeks. Camões, Lusiad, Portuguese. Paganel could say no more. His eyes wandered, while a peal of Homeric laughter rang in his ears. The Patagonian did not wink. He waited patiently for the explanation of this event, which was totally incomprehensible to him. Insensate fool, cried Paganel at last. What is it so? Is it not a mere joke? Have I done this? It is the confusion of languages as at Babel. My friends, to start for India and arrive at Chile, to learn Spanish and speak Portuguese. This is too much, and if it continues, I shall some day throw myself out of the window instead of my cigar. To hear Paganel take his blunder thus, to see his comical actions, it was impossible to keep serious. Besides, he set the example himself. Laugh, my friends, said he, laugh with a will, you cannot laugh as much as I do at myself. And he uttered the most formidable peal of laughter that ever issued from the mouth of a geographer. But we are none the less without an interpreter, said the Major. Oh, do not be troubled, replied Paganel. The Portuguese and Spanish resemble each other so much that I made a mistake. However, this very resemblance will soon enable me to rectify my error, and in a short time I will thank this worthy Patagonian in the language he speaks so well. Paganel was right, for he could soon exchange a few words with the native. He even learned that his name was Thalcave, a word which signifies in Araucanian, the thunderer. This surname was doubtless given to him for his skill in the use of firearms. Better prospects. But Glenarvan was particularly rejoiced to discover that the Patagonian was a guide, and moreover, a guide of the Pampas. There was, therefore, something so providential in this meeting that the success of the enterprise seemed already an accomplished fact, and no one any longer doubted the rescue of Captain Grant. In the meantime, the travelers and the Patagonian had returned to Robert. The latter stretched his arms towards the native, who, without a word, placed his hand upon his head. He examined the child and felt his wounded limbs. Then, smiling, he went and gathered on the banks of the stream a few handfuls of wild celery, with which he rubbed the boy's body. Under this treatment, performed with an extreme gentleness, the child felt his strength revive, and it was plain that a few hours would suffice to restore him. It was therefore decided that that day and the following night should be passed at the encampment. Besides, 2 important questions remained to be settled: food and means of conveyance. Provisions and mules were both wanting. Fortunately, Thalcave solved the difficulty. This guide, who was accustomed to conduct travelers along the Patagonian frontiers, and was one of the most intelligent Baquinos of the country, engaged to furnish Glenarvan all that his little party needed. He offered to take him to a tolderia, encampment of Indians, about 4 miles distant, where they would find everything necessary for the expedition. This proposal was made partly by gestures, partly by Spanish words which Paganel succeeded in understanding. It was accepted, and Glenarvan and his learned friend, taking leave of their companions, reascended the stream under the guidance of the Patagonian. They proceeded at a good pace for an hour and a half, taking long strides to keep up to the giant Thalcave. All the region was charming and of a rich fertility. The grassy pastures succeeded each other and could easily have fed thousands of cattle. Large ponds, united by a winding chain of streams, gave these plains a verdant moisture. Black-headed swans sported on the mirror-like surface and disputed the empire of the waters with numberless ostriches that gamboled over the plains, while the brilliant feathered tribes were in wonderful variety. Jacques Paganel proceeded from admiration to ecstasy. Exclamations of delight continually escaped his lips, to the astonishment of the Patagonian, who thought it very natural that there should be birds in the air, swans on the lakes, and grass on the prairies. The geographer had no reason to regret his walk or complain of its length. He scarcely believed himself started, or that the encampment would soon come in sight. This Tolderia was at the bottom of a narrow valley among the mountains. Here in huts of branches lived 30 wandering natives, grazing large herds of milch cows, sheep, cattle, and horses. Thus they roamed from one pasture to another, always finding a repast ready for their four-footed companions. Glenarvan going to market. Thalcave took upon himself the negotiation, which was not long. In return for 7 small Argentine horses, all saddled, 100 pounds of dried meat, a few measures of rice, and some leathern bottles for water, the Indians received 20 ounces of gold, the value of which they perfectly understood. Glenarvan would have bought another horse for the Patagonian, but he intimated that it was unnecessary. The bargain concluded, Glenarvan took leave of his new providers, as Paganel expressed it, and returned to the encampment. His arrival was welcomed by cries of joy at sight of the provisions and horses. Everyone ate with avidity. Robert partook of some nourishment. He had almost entirely regained his strength, and the remainder of the day was passed in perfect rest. Various subjects were alluded to: the absent dear ones, the Duncan, Captain Mangles, his brave crew, and Harry Grant, who was, perhaps, not far distant. As for Paganel, he did not leave the Indian. He became Thalcave's shadow, and could not remain quiet in the presence of a real Patagonian, in comparison with whom he would have passed for a dwarf. He overwhelmed the grave Indian with Spanish phrases, to which the latter quietly listened. The geographer studied this time without a book, and was often heard repeating words aloud. "If I do not get the accent," said he to the major, "you must not be angry with me. Who would have thought that one day a Patagonian would teach me Spanish?" Chapter 16. News of the Lost Captain. At 8 o'clock the next morning Thalcave gave the signal for departure. The slope was gradual, and the travelers had only to descend a gentle declivity to the sea. When the Patagonian declined the horse that Glenarvan offered him, the latter thought that he preferred to go on foot, according to the custom of certain guides, and indeed, his long legs ought to have made walking easy. But he was mistaken. At the moment of departure Thalcave whistled in a peculiar manner. Immediately a magnificent Argentine horse, of superb form, issued from a small wood nearby, and approached at the call of his master. The animal was perfectly beautiful. His brown color indicated a sound, spirited, and courageous beast. He had a small and elegantly poised head, widely opening nostrils, a fiery eye, large hams, swelling withers, broad breast, long pasterns, in short, all the qualities that constitute strength and suppleness. The major, like a perfect horseman, admired unreservedly this specimen of the horses of the plains. This beautiful creature was called Thayuca, which means bird in the Patagonian language, and he justly merited this appellation. A fresh start. When Thalcave was in the saddle, the horse pranced with spirited grace, and the Patagonian, a skillful rider, was magnificent to behold. His outfit comprised 2 weapons of the chase, the boluses and the lasso. The boluses consists of 3 balls tied together by a leathern string, which are fastened to the front of the saddle. The Indians frequently throw them the distance of 100 paces at the animal or enemy that they are pursuing, and with such precision that they twist about their legs and bring them to the ground. It is, therefore, in their hands a formidable instrument, and they handle it with surprising dexterity. The lasso, on the contrary, does not leave the hand that wields it. It consists simply of a leathern thong 30 feet in length, terminating in a slipnoose which works upon an iron ring. The right hand throws the slipnoose, while the left hand holds the remainder of the lasso, the end of which is firmly tied to the saddle. A long carbine in a sling completed the Patagonian's armament. Thalcave, without observing the admiration caused by his natural grace, ease, and courage, took the lead, and the party advanced, now at a gallop, and now at a walk, for their horses seemed entirely unaccustomed to trotting. Robert mounted with much boldness, and speedily convinced Glenarvan of his ability to keep his seat. On issuing from the gorges of the Andes, they encountered a great number of sand ridges, called medanos, real waves incessantly agitated by the wind, when the roots of the herbage did not confine them to the earth. This sand is of an extreme fineness, and at the least breath, they saw it float away in light clouds, or form regular sand columns which rose to a considerable height. This spectacle caused pleasure as well as annoyance to the eyes. Pleasure, for nothing was more curious than these columns, wandering over the plain, struggling, mingling, sinking, and rising in inexpressible confusion. And annoyance, since an impalpable dust emanated from these innumerable medanos and penetrated the eyelids, however tightly they were closed. This phenomenon continued during a great part of the day. Nevertheless, they advanced rapidly, and towards 6 o'clock the Andes, 40 miles distant, presented a darkish aspect already fading in the mists of the evening. The travelers were a little fatigued with their journey, and therefore saw with pleasure the approach of the hour for retiring. They encamped on the shores of a turbulent stream, enclosed by lofty red cliffs. Toward noon of the next day, the sun's rays became very oppressive, and at evening a line of clouds on the horizon indicated a change in the weather. The Patagonian could not be deceived, and pointed out to the geographer the western portion of the sky. "Good, I know," said Paganel, and addressing his companions, "a change in the weather is about to take place. We shall have a pampero." Talking like a book. He explained that this pampero is frequent on the Argentine plains. It is a very dry wind from the southwest. Thalcave was not mistaken, and during the night, which was quite uncomfortable for people sheltered with a simple poncho, the wind blew with great violence. The horses lay down on the ground, and the men near them in a close group. Glenarvan feared they would be delayed if the storm continued, but Paganel reassured him after consulting his barometer. "Ordinarily," said he, "this wind creates tempests which last for 3 days, but when the barometer rises as it does now, you are free from these furious hurricanes in a few hours. Be assured then, my dear friend, at break of day the sky will have resumed its usual clearness." "You talk like a book, Paganel," replied Glenarvan. "And I am one," replied Paganel, "which you are free to consult as much as you please." He was not mistaken. At 1 o'clock in the morning the wind suddenly subsided, and every one was able to enjoy an invigorating sleep. The next morning they rose bright and fresh, especially Paganel, who displayed great cheerfulness and animation. During this passage across the continent, Lord Glenarvan watched with scrupulous attention for the approach of the natives. He wished to question them concerning Captain Grant, by the aid of the Patagonian, with whom Paganel had begun to converse considerably, but they followed a path little frequented by the Indians, for the trails over the Pampas, which lead from the Argentine Republic to the Andes, are situated too far to the north. If by chance a wandering horseman appeared in the distance, he fled rapidly away, little caring to come in contact with strangers. However, although Glenarvan, in the interest of his search, regretted the absence of the Indians, an incident took place which singularly justified the interpretation of the document. Several times the course pursued by the expedition crossed paths on the Pampas, among others quite an important road, that from Carmen to Mendoza, distinguishable by the bones of such animals as mules, horses, sheep, and oxen, whose remains were scattered by the birds of prey and lay bleaching in the sun. There were thousands of them, and without doubt, more than one human skeleton had added its bones to those of these humbler animals. Hitherto Thalcave had made no remark concerning the line so rigorously followed. He understood, however, that if they kept no definite course over the Pampas, they would not come to cities or villages. Every morning they advanced towards the rising sun, without deviating from the straight line, and every evening the setting sun was behind them. In his capacity of guide, Thalcave must therefore have been astonished to see that not only he did not guide them, but that they guided him. Nevertheless, if he was astonished, with the reserve natural to the Indians he made no remark. But today arriving at the above-mentioned road, he stopped his horse, and turned towards Paganel. "Road to Carmen," said he. "Yes, my good Patagonian," replied the geographer in his purest Spanish, "road to Carmen and Mendoza." "We do not take it," resumed Thalcave. "No," answered Paganel. "And we are going always to the east." "That is going nowhere." "Who knows?" Thalcave was silent, and gazed at the geographer with profound surprise. He did not admit, however, that Paganel was joking the least in the world. An Indian, with his natural seriousness, never imagines that you are not speaking in earnest. "You are not going to Carmen, then?" he added, after an instant of silence. "A professorial difficulty." "No," replied Paganel. "Nor to Mendoza." "No." At this moment Glenarvan, rejoining Paganel, asked what Thalcave said, and why he had stopped. When he had told him, Glenarvan said, "Could you not explain to him the object of our expedition, and why we must always proceed toward the east?" "That would be very difficult," answered Paganel, "for an Indian understands nothing of geography." "But," said the Major seriously, "is it the history or the historian that he cannot understand?" "Ah, MacNab," said Paganel, "you still doubt my Spanish. Try, my worthy friend." "Very well."